the slaves. He attacked the U.S. Federal Armory in Harper's Ferry. He and several of his sons and a number of other people of African descent were involved in that project, along with Harriet Tubman, who was unable to participate. John Brown was executed by the United States government. But there have been many, many more recent people. In almost every struggle, you found people of European descent who allied themselves and seen that the interest of common working people is to unite with other oppressed and colonized people. And so, for example, David Gilbert, someone I knew from SDS, is still locked up. He's incarcerated in New York State. Just recently, a couple weeks ago, I met here with Susan Rosenberg, another former comrade and colleague of mine who was a political prisoner, a woman who was locked up under conditions of torture in the Lexington special unit that was created for the purpose of sensory deprivation. She was incarcerated along with Silvia Baraldini, an Italian national, and with Alejandrina Torres, another woman I knew quite well from the Puerto Rican independence struggle. And that control unit was found to be violating their human rights and was shut down as a result of an international campaign.
And are you familiar with the case of Marilyn Buck?
Yes, Marilyn Buck is another woman who was once considered to be the quote-unquote quartermaster of the Black Liberation Army. She was a white woman who was in active solidarity with people's right to self-defense and self-determination. She was freed from prison by a process of getting out of prison on her own. Was eventually recaptured, accused of being part of what was called the resistance conspiracy. She and a number of other people. She more recently was released from prison near death and died shortly after being released from custody. Other people accused in that conspiracy, so-called resistance conspiracy, were the same people I mentioned. Also Linda Evans, another woman who was released from custody on the basis of the fact that her incarceration was political. In many of these cases, what you see is that the charges do not justify the sentences. Most of the political prisoners, you can kind of tell because the sentences are so outlandish. Susan Rosenberg was convicted of possession of explosive materials and was sentenced to, I believe, 76 years in prison. In the same rough period of time, a man named Dennis Malvisi was convicted of several clinic bombings in which he actually carried out explosive attacks, and he was sentenced to 7 years, released after 3. So I think that there's a clear disparity between the sentencing and the crime that indicates the political nature of the incarceration as well as the circumstances. And what we've seen is that those, once those things are made to stick on the political prisoners, then they become massified. And so after they arrested people like Geronimo and some of the other Black Panthers we talked about earlier, they were able to carry out a mass incarceration. And in the same token, as they began to put into effect these special control units, they've created prisons within prisons, and they're not only targeting political prisoners, but anybody who stands up within the prison or dissents is locked up. There's a man named Daniel McGowan, someone else I knew and worked with, who is now locked up for actions associated with the Environmental Liberation Front. He was placed in what's called a communications management unit, and about 98% of the people in that unit are actually Muslim prisoners, but they dressed it up by throwing a few political radicals like Daniel in that prison, where they're restricted from any communication with their families except for one call a week for 15 minutes, and for most human contact.
Are you familiar with the case of Viola Liuzzo?
Viola Liuzzo was a white woman who was active in the civil rights movement. She was killed actually by an FBI informant who was operating within the Ku Klux Klan at that time, and was later determined to have been, under federal control when he carried out that assassination. I grew up with a young man. We called him Mickey, Michael Schwerner. He and James Chaney and another man named Goodman were killed under color of law in Mississippi. They were civil rights workers and were basically turned over by sheriffs to the Klan and killed by people operating with law enforcement to oppose the civil rights movement. And so there's a long history of those kinds of attacks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a few questions I would like to ask you a lot of questions on behalf of the state, but we're going to limit ourselves today
Okay.
to a few questions. Didn't some of these individuals that you have named